Not everybody who cries victim is an infant. Some of the creatures that cry victim are monsters, and you shouldn't clutch them to your breast. That's what Eve does with the snake. She clutches the serpentine to her breast. Why? To announce to herself the supreme power of her compassion. Right. That's the pattern. That's the eternal pattern of female sin as laid out in the second story in the biblical corpus. What's the sin of man? Adam. Because he falls immediately after Eve. Eve hearkens to the voice of the serpent, who is the immediate manifestation of the Luciferian spirit of the usurper and the deceiver. That's the mythological structure. What does that mean? Psychopaths use victim status to gain what they want. Right. And prideful, compassionate fools fall for it. Why? To elevate their compassion to the highest place. Not a wise move. What's Adam's sin? What do men want? They want to impress women. I worked with lawyers for years, high-end lawyers, people who ran law firms or who were partners of senior law firms, and they made a lot of money. $1,000 an hour, a lot of money. Why were they interested in the money? Well, there are materialistic reasons for being interested in money. We don't have to cover them. But most of them regarded the money, especially their bonuses, as, what did they say? That's how we keep score. What did that mean? Well, that was how the men rank ordered themselves in the status hierarchy within the firms. And that's very common among men. They're rank ordering status all the time. Why? Because women peel from the top. The biggest predictor of a woman's attractiveness to a man's attractiveness to a woman cross-culturally is his comparative status among other men. It's a walloping predictor. It's by far the biggest contributor. And we said, why? Well, why? Well, because a woman doesn't need another infant, right? She needs someone who can help. And how does she find out? Well, she sees who wins the contest among men, and she assumes that the winner is the winner. And so why not have him? And it's a perfectly reasonable way of conducting an analysis. It can be gamed. But that's a different story. So what's Adam's sin? He tries to impress Eve. So when she comes to him announcing her new relationship with the serpentine, he says, no problem, dear, whatever you want, and fails to establish the proper borders of order. What happens? That's the fall of mankind. Okay, so what does that mean? It's a very complicated idea. There's a Christian idea, deep Christian idea, that suffering is the consequence of sin, and that the worst sin, let's say, is the sin of pride. Adam and Eve both fall prey to the sin of pride in the feminine way and the masculine way. Adam says, I got this, baby. And Eve says, we can even clutch the serpent to our breasts. Right. That's their typical forms of pathology. What happens to people who bite off more than they can chew? What happens to people who attempt to incorporate and digest the inedible? They fall. That's what happens to Adam and Eve. Pride comes before a fall. Okay, so what does that have to do with suffering? That's a complicated question, right? Because you might think, and rightly so, that suffering itself seems to be built into the structure of the world, right? I mean, we're fragile. We can be hurt. Our children are hurt. They stumble. They scrape their knees. They break their arms and legs. They develop terrible diseases like we all do. There seems to be an element of suffering and vulnerability built into the world. What else causes suffering? Biting off more than you can chew, right? So you imagine how many times you're struggling forward in disenchanted misery because you've fallen away from what you should pursue, because you've falsely aggrandized yourself or taken on a task, claimed to be able to take on a task or to have a skill that you don't possess. setting yourself up for a fall. What's the consequence of that? Misery.